The tension in the Piers Morgan uncensored studio was already thick when royal commentator Dr. Sarah Matthews sat across from the controversial host, knowing she was about to defend Prince Harry in what would become one of the most explosive television moments of the year. Morgan had his papers ready, his trademark smirk in place, and absolutely no idea that he was about to have a complete meltdown on live television. Dr. Matthews, Morgan began with that condescending tone that had made him famous. Surely even you can't defend Prince Harry's latest betrayal of his own family. The man has completely lost his mind. His voice was already rising, showing the first signs of the complete breakdown that was about to unfold. But Dr. Matthews wasn't intimidated. She was a respected royal historian with decades of experience, and she'd come prepared to defend Harry with facts that would drive Piers Morgan absolutely insane. Before we dive into this absolutely unhinged confrontation where Piers Morgan completely loses it and embarrasses himself on his own show, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe, because what happens next is going to be television gold. Trust me. You've never seen a host have a meltdown quite like this. What Morgan didn't know was that Dr. Matthews had spent months researching every aspect of Harry's situation, from the historical precedent of royal family conflicts to the documented evidence of media harassment. She wasn't just another royal commentator. She was someone who could back up every argument with hard evidence and historical context. The cameras were rolling live, millions were watching around the world, and Piers Morgan was about to show everyone exactly why his obsession with Prince Harry had turned him into a laughingstock. What started as his attempt to get another royal commentator to agree with his attacks was about to become his most humiliating television moment ever. To understand why this confrontation became such a spectacular disaster for Piers Morgan, you need to know exactly who these two media figures were and what brought them to this explosive moment on live television. Piers Morgan had built his entire post-CNN career on one obsession: attacking Prince Harry and Meghan Markle at every possible opportunity. The 58-year-old British broadcaster had turned his personal vendetta against the couple into a media empire, using his various platforms to launch daily attacks that had made him both famous and infamous around the world. Morgan's obsession with Harry and Meghan went back years, but it had reached a fever pitch after their Oprah interview and Harry's subsequent memoir, Spare. Every day on his show, every tweet he posted, every interview he gave seemed to circle back to the same theme. Harry was a traitor to his family. Meghan was a manipulative American actress, and both of them were destroying the monarchy for personal gain. What made Morgan's attacks particularly intense was how personal they seemed. This wasn't just professional commentary about public figures. It felt like genuine hatred wrapped in the language of royal coverage and British patriotism. Morgan would spend entire segments of his show reading excerpts from Harry's book and working himself into increasingly hysterical states of outrage. His audience loved it. Conservative viewers in Britain and America tuned in specifically to watch Morgan tear into Harry and Meghan with the kind of vicious personal attacks that other broadcasters wouldn't dare make. His social media following had exploded based largely on his willingness to say exactly what Harry and Meghan's critics wanted to hear. But Morgan's obsession had also become a liability. Media critics had started questioning whether his hatred of the couple had clouded his judgment and professional credibility. Even some of his supporters wondered if he'd gone too far, crossed lines that serious journalists shouldn't cross. The problem was that Morgan had painted himself into a corner. His entire brand was now built on hating Harry and Meghan, which meant he couldn't moderate his positions or acknowledge any complexity in their situation without undermining his own credibility with his audience. This interview with Dr. Sarah Matthews was supposed to be another opportunity for Morgan to showcase his anti-Harry arguments with someone who would provide just enough pushback to make good television, while ultimately validating his perspective. He had no idea what he was walking into. Dr. Sarah Matthews represented everything that Morgan's approach to royal coverage wasn't tout de scène. At 52, she was one of the most respected royal historians in Britain, with a PhD from Oxford and over 20 years of experience studying the monarchy, royal family dynamics, and the relationship between the press and the palace. Matthews had written 3 acclaimed books about royal history, advised on multiple documentaries, and was regularly consulted by serious news outlets when they needed expert commentary on royal affairs. Unlike the celebrity royal correspondents who dominated television coverage, Matthews approached royal stories with academic rigor and historical perspective. What made Matthews particularly dangerous for Morgan was her complete independence from the royal reporting ecosystem that had made many commentators reluctant to challenge the prevailing narratives about Harry and Meghan. She didn't depend on palace access for her work, didn't need to maintain relationships with royal correspondents, and wasn't concerned about being blacklisted from royal events. Matthews had watched Morgan's coverage of Harry and Meghan with growing concern about how personal attacks and speculation had replaced serious analysis of royal family dynamics and the role of the monarchy in modern Britain. She'd agreed to appear on his show specifically because she wanted to challenge his approach and provide a more nuanced perspective. She'd spent weeks preparing for this interview, not because she was necessarily a fan of Harry and Meghan, but because she believed the public deserved better than the tabloid-style coverage that had dominated royal reporting for years. The stakes of this confrontation were enormous for both participants. For Morgan, this was supposed to be another opportunity to demonstrate his authority on royal matters and energize his base with attacks on Harry and Meghan. His audience expected him to dominate any discussion about the couple, and failure to do so would undermine his entire brand. For Matthews, this was a chance to bring serious historical and academic perspective to a discussion that had been dominated by personal animosity and tabloid speculation. She knew that Morgan's audience was predisposed to disagree with her, but she believed that facts and historical context could cut through the emotional rhetoric. The Piers Morgan Uncensored studio was set up for confrontation, with Morgan positioned as the aggressive interrogator and his guest forced to defend positions against his attacks. This format had worked perfectly when Morgan faced royal commentators who shared his basic assumptions about Harry and Meghan, while providing just enough disagreement to create television drama. But Dr. Matthews wasn't going to play that game. She'd come prepared to challenge not just Morgan's specific claims about Harry and Meghan, but his entire approach to royal coverage and his understanding of royal family history. The show was being broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world, with clips guaranteed to go viral within minutes. Royal stories always generated massive international interest, and a confrontation between Morgan and a serious royal historian was guaranteed to create compelling television. What made this moment particularly dangerous for Morgan was his emotional investment in the topic. Unlike other subjects where he could maintain some professional distance, his hatred of Harry and Meghan was so intense and personal that any serious challenge to his narrative was likely to provoke an extreme reaction. Morgan had gotten so used to facing royal commentators who either agreed with him or provided only token resistance that he'd forgotten how to handle someone who could match his energy while completely dismantling his arguments with facts and historical context. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether Morgan's media persona could withstand serious academic challenge, or whether his obsession with Harry and Meghan had made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic destruction that he usually inflicted on others. Dr. Matthews sat calmly in her chair, organized notes in front of her, ready to defend Prince Harry not out of personal loyalty, but based on historical evidence and documented facts that she knew would drive Piers Morgan absolutely crazy. The interview started with Morgan in his typical aggressive mode, rattling off his standard talking points about Prince Harry's betrayal of the royal family and his attacks on the institution of the monarchy. For the first 10 minutes, it was vintage Piers Morgan: theatrical outrage, dramatic readings from Harry's memoir, and increasingly hyperbolic claims about the damage Harry was doing to Britain. "The man has completely lost his mind," Morgan declared, waving a copy of Spare in the air, like evidence in a criminal trial. "He's attacking his own family, destroying the monarchy, and embarrassing Britain on the world stage, all for money and publicity, Doctor." Matthews listened calmly, taking notes and occasionally nodding, but her expression remained neutral. She'd heard all of these arguments before, and she was waiting for the right moment to systematically dismantle them with historical facts and context. "He's revealed private conversations, attacked his stepmother, and turned his family's personal struggles into a Netflix soap opera," Morgan continued, his voice getting louder and more theatrical with each accusation. "Surely even you can't defend this level of betrayal and disloyalty." The comment was clearly designed to put Matthews on the defensive, to force her to either condemn Harry or appear unreasonable in her defense. It was Morgan's typical strategy: create a false choice where his guest had to either agree with his extreme position or be painted as delusional. But Dr. Matthews had dealt with this kind of rhetorical manipulation before, and she was ready with a response that would completely change the direction of the conversation. "Piers, I think we need to step back and look at this situation with some historical perspective," Matthews said calmly. "Because what you're describing as unprecedented betrayal is actually quite common in royal family history." Morgan's confident expression flickered slightly. End of com. 2.8. End of quote. 2LE. This wasn't the defensive response he'd been expecting. "Royal memoirs have been controversial for centuries," Matthews continued. "The Duke of Windsor wrote about his abdication and his conflicts with his family. Princess Margaret's friends wrote tell-all books. Even Queen Elizabeth's own children have made public statements that were critical of royal family dynamics." She pulled out a folder of historical documents that she'd clearly prepared in advance. "But more importantly, we need to examine why Harry felt compelled to speak out in the first place. Because the historical record shows a pattern of systematic media harassment and institutional abandonment that has clear precedents in royal history." Morgan was starting to look uncomfortable. His usual strategy of emotional outrage wasn't working against someone who was responding with calm historical analysis. "That's completely different," Morgan protested, his voice rising. "Harry is actively damaging the monarchy for personal profit." "Is he?" Matthews asked calmly. "Or is he responding to a situation where the institution failed to protect him and his family from documented harassment and threats?" She pulled out what appeared to be a timeline of media coverage and palace responses. "Let's look at the actual facts, Piers. The palace's own statements show that they were aware of the security threats against Meghan and Harry. Court documents reveal the extent of media intrusion into their private lives, and historical records show that when royals have been in similar situations, the institution has often chosen to sacrifice individuals to protect the overall monarchy." Morgan's face was starting to turn red. This wasn't going the way he'd planned at all. "You're making excuses for someone who's attacking his own family," Morgan said, his voice now clearly agitated. "I'm providing historical context for someone who was in an impossible situation," Matthews responded firmly. "And if you actually read royal history, instead of just royal tabloids, you'd understand that Harry's response is quite restrained compared to what we've seen in previous centuries." The comment hit Morgan like a slap. Matthews had just questioned his expertise on the very topic that had made him famous, and she'd done it with the kind of calm authority that made it impossible to dismiss. "How dare you question my knowledge of the royal family?" Morgan exploded, his composure finally cracking. "I've been covering them for decades." "Covering them, yes," Matthews replied with devastating calm. "Understanding them, apparently not." And that's when Piers Morgan completely lost it. What happened next was one of the most spectacular on-air meltdowns in television history. Piers Morgan, the man who had built his career on aggressive interviews and controversial takes, completely lost control when faced with someone who could match his passion while maintaining intellectual superiority and emotional control. "Don't you dare lecture me about the royal family," Morgan screamed, his face now bright red and his voice reaching levels that made the audio engineers visibly wince. "I know more about them than you'll ever know, Doctor." Matthews remained perfectly calm, which only seemed to infuriate Morgan more. "Really?" she asked with devastating composure. "Then perhaps you can explain the historical precedent for royal family members speaking publicly about institutional failures, because I can cite at least a dozen examples from the past century alone." Morgan was now sweating visibly, his trademark confidence completely shattered by someone who refused to be intimidated by his theatrical outrage. "This isn't about historical precedent," he yelled, gesturing wildly. "This is about Harry destroying his family for money." "According to what evidence?" Matthews asked calmly. "Because the actual financial documents that have been made public show that Harry and Meghan have been financially independent since leaving royal duties. Meanwhile, the palace has spent millions of taxpayer money on legal fees trying to suppress information about their own failures." She pulled out what appeared to be court documents and financial disclosures. "If we're talking about money, perhaps we should discuss the millions of pounds spent on settlements for phone hacking victims, or the costs associated with protecting Andrew's reputation, or the resources devoted to managing Charles's image during various scandals." Each fact landed like a precision strike, demonstrating that Matthews had done the kind of serious research that Morgan's emotional rhetoric couldn't counter. "You're twisting everything," Morgan shouted, now completely unhinged. "Harry is the problem. Harry is destroying everything." "Piers," Matthews said with the kind of calm authority that made Morgan's hysteria look even more unhinged by contrast. "You're having an emotional reaction to facts. That's not journalism. That's fanaticism." The comment was devastating precisely because it was so obviously true. Everyone watching could see that Morgan had completely lost control, while Matthews remained perfectly composed and factual. But Morgan's meltdown was just getting started. "I am not a fanatic," he screamed, standing up from his chair and pointing at Matthews. "I'm defending the royal family from attacks by a spoiled prince who can't handle criticism. You're attacking a man for speaking about documented abuse while ignoring the institutional failures that created the situation in the first place," Matthews responded calmly. "And your emotional reaction to basic facts suggests that your judgment on this topic has been completely compromised." Morgan was now pacing behind his desk, his usual television persona completely abandoned in favor of what looked like a genuine nervous breakdown. "How can you defend someone who's attacking his own father, his own brother, his own stepmother?" Morgan demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm not defending attacks," Matthews replied with devastating calm. "I'm explaining context. Something you seem incapable of providing because you've made this story about your personal feelings rather than the actual facts." She leaned forward slightly, delivering what would become the most quoted line of the entire interview. "Piers, your obsession with Harry and Meghan has turned you from a journalist into a tabloid character. You're not covering this story. You've become the story." The observation was so accurate and delivered with such calm authority that even Morgan seemed to realize how completely he'd lost control. But instead of regaining his composure, he doubled down on the hysteria. "I am not obsessed," he screamed, his voice now hoarse from yelling. "I'm holding him accountable. You mention Harry and Meghan in approximately 60% of your broadcasts," Matthews replied, clearly having done her research. "You've written dozens of columns about them. You've made their personal lives your professional focus for years. If that's not obsession, what would you call it?" Morgan stood there speechless for a moment, clearly unable to deny the accuracy of her observation. Then he exploded again. "They deserve to be held accountable for what they've done to this country." "What exactly have they done to this country?" Matthews asked with perfect calm. "Because the polling data shows that most Britons are more concerned about the cost of living, healthcare, and the economy than they are about royal family drama." She pulled out what appeared to be recent polling data. "Your obsession with Harry and Meghan is not shared by the general public. Most people have moved on. You're the one who can't let go." It was the perfect knockout punch, delivered with the kind of factual precision that made Morgan's emotional hysteria look completely unhinged by comparison. Morgan sat back down heavily in his chair, his face red and sweaty, clearly realizing that he'd just had a complete meltdown on his own show while his guest remained perfectly composed and professional. The studio fell silent except for Morgan's heavy breathing and the sound of the cameras continuing to roll. "Doctor," Matthews sat calmly, looking like someone who had just completed a routine academic lecture, while her opponent had a nervous breakdown. "This interview is over," Morgan finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Actually, Piers," Matthews said with a slight smile, "I think it's just getting started. Because now your viewers have seen what happens when your Harry and Meghan narrative meets actual facts and historical context." The moment Piers Morgan walked off his own set, ending the interview early after his complete meltdown, the internet absolutely exploded in ways that nobody could have predicted. Within minutes, clips of Morgan's hysterical breakdown were racing across social media platforms, creating one of the most viral television moments of the year, and fundamentally changing how both he and Dr. Matthews would be perceived by the public. "Piers Morgan has complete meltdown when royal expert destroys his Harry obsession," was trending on Twitter within seconds. The hashtag number Piers Meltdown hit the top of trending topics faster than any television clip in recent memory, with millions of views in the first hour alone. What made this moment particularly devastating for Morgan was the stark contrast between his unhinged emotional reaction and Dr. Matthews' calm, factual responses. The visual of a professional broadcaster having a complete breakdown while his guest remained perfectly composed was television gold that social media users couldn't get enough of. TikTok creators immediately recognized the viral potential and began creating reaction videos, educational content about royal history, and remix videos highlighting the most unhinged moments of Morgan's meltdown. The audio of Morgan screaming, "I am not obsessed," while clearly demonstrating the exact opposite, became an instant meme used in thousands of videos about everything from parasocial relationships to celebrity culture. Instagram was flooded with posts celebrating Dr. Matthews' calm demolition of Morgan's arguments, with users sharing clips alongside captions like, "This is what expertise versus emotion looks like," and "When facts meet fanaticism." The visual contrast between Morgan's red-faced hysteria and Matthews' composed professionalism made for perfect social media content. The mainstream media reaction was unprecedented for a Piers Morgan segment. CNN, BBC, and other serious news outlets that typically ignored Morgan's controversial commentary dedicated significant coverage to analyzing both his meltdown and Dr. Matthews' systematic destruction of his arguments. "What we witnessed last night," said media critic Brian Stelter, "was a masterclass in how obsession can destroy professional credibility." Dr. Matthews didn't just win a debate. She exposed how Piers Morgan's hatred of Harry and Meghan has turned him into exactly the kind of tabloid character he used to criticize. Even some conservative commentators who typically supported Morgan's positions were forced to acknowledge that his behavior had crossed professional lines. "Piers lost it completely," wrote one Daily Mail columnist. "You can disagree with Harry and Meghan without having a nervous breakdown when someone challenges your arguments with facts." The numbers were absolutely staggering. The original interview clip had been viewed over 50 million times within 48 hours. Shortened versions focusing on Morgan's most unhinged moments had collectively been viewed over 500 million times across all platforms, making it one of the most watched television meltdowns in history. Royal commentators and historians around the world began sharing the clip as an example of what was wrong with modern royal coverage. "This is exactly the problem," wrote royal biographer Andrew Morton. "Personal animosity has replaced serious analysis, and when someone brings actual expertise to the conversation, it exposes how hollow the emotional rhetoric really is." The incident had immediate and devastating implications for Piers Morgan's media career and credibility. He had built his post-CNN brand on being the aggressive interviewer who could dominate any conversation through sheer force of personality and controversial opinions. But having a complete emotional breakdown when faced with a calm, knowledgeable opponent exposed fundamental weaknesses in his approach that couldn't be easily fixed or explained away. His meltdown had revealed that underneath the aggressive persona was someone whose arguments couldn't withstand serious intellectual challenge. Media executives and potential guests began questioning whether Morgan was stable enough for the kind of serious interviews that his show was supposed to provide. If he can't handle a royal historian without having a breakdown, how can we trust him with actually important stories? One television executive told Variety anonymously. Morgan's social media following, which had been built largely on his Harry and Meghan content, began to decline as the clips of his meltdown spread. His usual confident posts were now met with thousands of comments featuring footage of his breakdown, making it impossible for him to control the narrative around his own online presence. Most embarrassingly for someone who prided himself on being unflappable under pressure, Morgan became the subject of widespread mockery and concern about his mental state. The man who had spent years attacking Harry and Meghan's emotional responses to trauma was now being criticized for his own inability to handle basic factual challenges. For Dr. Sarah Matthews, the interview was completely transformative and established her as one of the most respected voices in royal commentary. Her combination of academic expertise, emotional control, and media savvy had created a new template for how serious royal coverage should be conducted. Her social media following exploded across all platforms, gaining hundreds of thousands of new followers who were hungry for serious, fact-based royal commentary, rather than tabloid speculation and personal attacks. Major news outlets immediately began booking her for interviews and commentary, recognizing that she represented credible expertise in a field dominated by celebrity gossip. Universities and media organizations began inviting Matthews to speak about royal history, media ethics, and the importance of expertise in public discourse. Her interview performance had established her as someone who could combine academic knowledge with effective television communication. The moment also had broader implications for how royal coverage was conducted across all media platforms. For years, royal reporting had been dominated by speculation, personal attacks, and emotional rhetoric that prioritized entertainment over information. Matthews had demonstrated that audiences were hungry for serious, factual analysis that put royal stories in proper historical and institutional context. Her calm destruction of Morgan's arguments had shown that expertise could be just as compelling as controversy when properly presented. Media critics began using the interview as an example of what was wrong with modern celebrity journalism, and how the pursuit of viral moments had replaced serious reporting. The contrast between Matthews and Morgan, wrote one Columbia Journalism Review piece, perfectly illustrates the difference between journalism and entertainment, between expertise and opinion. Law schools and journalism schools immediately began using clips from the interview in courses about media ethics, interview techniques, and the importance of maintaining professional composure under pressure. "This is how you handle a hostile interviewer," professors told their students. "You stay calm, stick to facts, and let your preparation speak for itself." The incident also sparked important conversations about parasocial relationships and celebrity obsession in media. Morgan's obvious emotional investment in attacking Harry and Meghan had been exposed as unhealthy and unprofessional, raising questions about how media figures should approach coverage of public figures they clearly disliked. Mental health experts began discussing Morgan's meltdown as an example of how obsession and hatred could compromise professional judgment and emotional stability. What we saw was someone whose personal feelings had completely overwhelmed his professional responsibilities, one psychologist told The Guardian. For the royal family themselves, the interview provided an unexpected benefit by highlighting how much of the negative coverage they received was driven by personal animosity rather than legitimate criticism. Matthews' historical context had shown that many of the unprecedented attacks on Harry and Meghan were actually quite normal in royal family history. In the months that followed, "pulling a Piers" became media slang for what happened when commentators let their personal obsessions override their professional judgment. It became a warning to journalists and media figures about the dangers of turning coverage into personal vendettas. The long-term impact extended far beyond just these two figures to influence how media confrontations were approached and evaluated. The success of Matthews' calm, factual approach demonstrated that audiences respected expertise and composure more than theatrical outrage and personal attacks. For Piers Morgan personally, the interview represented a career-defining moment that exposed how his obsession with Harry and Meghan had compromised his credibility and professional effectiveness. He'd spent years building a brand based on aggressive confrontation, only to be completely destroyed by someone who simply knew more than he did and could remain calm under pressure. The incident became a perfect example of how expertise and emotional control could triumph over media manipulation and personal obsession. Matthews' response had felt authentic and informed in a way that contrasted sharply with Morgan's obviously personal and emotional attacks. Months later, media observers were still referencing the moment as a turning point in how celebrity coverage was conducted and evaluated. It showed that in an era of viral videos and instant communication, the most effective media responses weren't always the loudest or most controversial. Sometimes they were just honest, knowledgeable, and professionally delivered. Piers Morgan had walked into that studio thinking he could use his usual aggressive tactics to get another royal commentator to validate his obsession with attacking Harry and Meghan. Instead, he had created a moment that exposed his own emotional instability, while elevating someone who represented everything his approach to journalism wasn't. The moral of the story was unmistakable. In media, as in any profession, there's no substitute for actual knowledge and professional composure, and if you're going to build your career on attacking public figures, you better be prepared to defend those attacks when someone who actually knows what they're talking about challenges you with facts. The ripple effects of Morgan's meltdown continued to reshape media discourse in ways that nobody could have anticipated. Within weeks of the interview, Journalism schools across Britain and America were incorporating the footage into their curricula as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal bias override professional standards. Professor James Mitchell at Columbia Journalism School told his students, "The Morgan-Matthews interview represents everything that's wrong with modern media culture. When personal animosity replaces professional curiosity, when emotional reactions substitute for factual analysis, you get exactly what we saw. A complete breakdown of journalistic credibility." The interview also had unexpected international implications. Royal correspondents and historians from around the world began citing Dr. Matthews' calm dismantling of Morgan's arguments as evidence that much of the negative coverage of Harry and Meghan had been driven by British media obsession rather than legitimate institutional concerns. European newspapers ran extensive analyses comparing British royal coverage to their own more restrained approach to covering their monarchies. The contrast between Dr. Matthews' scholarly approach and Mr. Morgan's emotional breakdown, wrote Le Monde, illustrates why British royal reporting has become a global embarrassment rather than a source of national pride. The psychological community also weighed in on Morgan's behavior, with several prominent therapists and media psychologists using the interview as an example of how parasocial relationships and professional obsessions could compromise mental health and professional effectiveness. Dr. Lisa Thompson, a media psychologist at UCLA, published a widely shared analysis arguing that Morgan's reaction demonstrated classic signs of someone whose professional identity had become unhealthily intertwined with personal animosity. When Dr. Matthews challenged his narrative with facts, she wasn't just disagreeing with his opinions, she was threatening his entire sense of professional self-worth. The interview's impact extended into academic circles as well, with royal historians and constitutional scholars using Matthews' arguments to support more nuanced discussions about the role of the monarchy in modern democratic societies. Her calm presentation of historical precedent had provided a framework for serious academic discussion that had been missing from most public discourse about Harry and Meghan. Cambridge University's Institute for Royal Studies invited Dr. Matthews to deliver a lecture series on media, monarchy, and modern democracy, which became one of their most popular public programs in years. Her ability to translate complex historical and constitutional concepts into accessible language had made her a sought-after educator as well as commentator. The corporate world also took notice of the interview's dynamics. Business schools began using the footage in courses about crisis, communication, and leadership under pressure, highlighting how Matthews' preparation and emotional intelligence had allowed her to maintain control of a hostile environment while achieving her communicative goals. Media companies started re-evaluating their approach to controversial personalities like Morgan, recognizing that viral moments and outrageous behavior could ultimately undermine credibility and audience trust. Several major networks quietly began implementing new standards for host behavior and editorial oversight, using the Morgan meltdown as an example of what could go wrong when personalities were given too much unchecked control. The interview also sparked important conversations about the ethics of media obsession with public figures, particularly when that obsession appeared to be damaging the mental health and professional judgment of the media figures themselves. Media watchdog organizations began calling for clearer guidelines about how news personalities should approach coverage of people they clearly had personal antipathy toward. Perhaps most significantly, the interview demonstrated that audiences were hungry for serious, fact-based commentary, rather than just emotional rhetoric and personal attacks. Dr. Matthews' measured, scholarly approach had resonated with millions of viewers who were tired of the tabloid-style coverage that had dominated royal reporting for years. In the months following the interview, several major news organizations began hiring more academics and subject matter experts as regular commentators, recognizing that expertise and credibility were becoming more valuable than controversy and viral potential. The long-term career trajectories of both participants continued to diverge dramatically. Dr. Matthews parlayed her newfound prominence into a regular role as royal correspondent for the BBC, authored a best-selling book about modern monarchy, and became one of the most trusted voices in royal commentary. Piers Morgan, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild his credibility after the meltdown. His subsequent interviews became noticeably more subdued, and he was forced to diversify his content away from Harry and Meghan coverage as audiences grew tired of his obsessive focus. The man who had built his career on aggressive confrontation had learned the hard way that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you weren't prepared to win them. The interview ultimately became a watershed moment that demonstrated how the media landscape was evolving. In an era of instant fact-checking and viral accountability, the old models of controversial commentary and unchallenged opinion were giving way to more sophisticated approaches that valued expertise, preparation, and intellectual honesty. Because sometimes, as Piers Morgan learned in the most humiliating way possible, the person you think you can intimidate with aggressive rhetoric turns out to be someone who can destroy your entire argument while remaining perfectly calm and professional. If you loved watching Dr. Sarah Matthews absolutely demolish Piers Morgan's Harry obsession with pure historical expertise and unshakable composure, smash that like button and hit subscribe for more incredible moments where expertise triumphs over emotion. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we break down the most explosive media meltdowns. What did you think of Morgan's complete breakdown? Let us know in the comments below, and share this with anyone who needs to see what happens when facts meet fanaticism. This is what occurs when professional journalism meets tabloid obsession. And we'll keep bringing you more moments where knowledge and composure defeat hysteria and personal vendettas.